I've started something over 4,000 companies over the years. And there are stages that every company goes through that are very easy to define. One of the stages is the idea stage, somebody coming up with a brilliant idea and sharing it with friends. And all of a sudden you get somebody who says, hey, let's make a business out of it. And pretty soon you've got something going if you drive hard enough and work enough hours. A next stage is this legal part where you check to see if you can protect anything that you have. And then you form an entity and you set yourself up to give out stock to the founders and other people. The next stage is writing your business plan, which says, what you're going to do. It's a moving target. I know you spent a lot of time on it. We could spend a lot of time on it tonight, but we're going to focus on a different area in a minute. The last stage, by the way, is raising money, at least for the startup. It's an arduous task. It's a full-time task. There's an art to it. There are things that work and there are things that don't work. We're not going to get in heavily into that tonight, but rather we're going to go back to when you first start a company, what happens. And it's a very thoughtful process. Initially come up with a great idea and you say, wow, what do I do with it? I'm afraid to tell anybody about it because if I do, they'll steal it from me. If they can steal it from you, good for them. If you have an idea that you can protect, that you think you can protect, talk to somebody who can help you with that, an attorney who knows patent law. You can do a trademark search on names, a copyright search on information to see if there are things that you can protect before you go out there. When you go out there to meet people to help you make this happen, to raise money, to build your team, you need to be careful who you meet with. If you walk into a meeting with somebody and you're almost afraid to shake their hand because they're kind of greasy, don't meet with them. People call me up and say, hey, I met this guy who wants to put $1 million in my company, but he sounds kind of, funny. And I say, what do you mean? And they explain to me what they mean. And I say, don't meet with him. If you're not comfortable with him, don't meet with him. There's something called an NDA, which I'm sure you've heard of, a non-disclosure agreement. We've probably drawn 10,000 of them over the years. We've actually had one lawsuit in 48 years on an NDA. They're very weak agreements. They're almost impossible to enforce. They're expensive to enforce. I don't even ask people to sign them. What I do is I protect as much as I can before you meet with people. Now, when you're dealing with your friends, you have this brand new idea. I've had young students come up to me and say, I'm afraid to tell anybody about it because if I tell them about it, I could lose it. That's not the right attitude. The right attitude is to tell everybody that you know, that you trust, that you care about the idea. What happens is some of those people may really like what you're doing and they say, hey, I want to join the team. Can I help you to make this happen? And if you're lucky, you build a real team. That team includes a CEO, a CFO, a COO, a chief marketing person, and what I call a chief money man, the guy who knows how to raise the money. Once in a while, there's one person who's able to do all of those functions. It's very rare. Maybe once every 2 years, we form 100 companies a year. Maybe once every 2 years, we'll run into somebody who can do the projections, who can write the business plan, who can do the marketing plan, who can go out and raise money literally on their own. Almost all of the time, it's 2 or 3 or 4 people who get together to say, hey, let's make this happen. And they complement each other and they start working at night for free and weekends. And pretty soon, it's a full-time job on the side of being a full-time student. And that's how most young businesses get started. And it's a wonderful process. The question that always comes up is how do you figure out, first, how to share the ownership with everyone? And secondly, how to raise money and how much do you give away when you go to raise that money? Let's talk about the issue of how much do you give away when you raise money first. There's something called pre-money valuation. If you haven't been exposed to it, I'm going to bring it up to you for a minute because you need to understand it for all of our discussions. The pre-money valuation is the value that you think the company has today. And you test it in the marketplace. You go out and talk to people. I think my company's worth $100 million. And they laugh at you. You say, I think my company's worth $2 million. And they'll say to you, why do you think it's worth $2 million? And then you tell them about the market, and you tell them about the products you're going to make and why it's unique and who the competitors are and how big it could be. And the idea is the more that you accomplish before you go out to raise money, the easier it will be to raise money and the higher your pre-money valuation will be. I'm going to give you a really quick, simple example. If your pre-money valuation is $2 million and you go out to raise $1 million, your post-money valuation after the money is invested is $3 million. And your investors are going to take their $1 million divided by the $3 million post-money, they're going to get a third of your company. It's really important to understand that to see how your cap table builds up. The cap table, which you've probably gone over as part of building a business plan, shows who all the shareholders are and how much stock they have and how that stock ownership is changed when you bring more people in and when you go out to raise money based upon different valuations. So let's go back to your original group of people. Almost every company that I've ever been involved with that starts to have success runs into a problem with the original shareholders wanting to have more. Now, that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It's a good thing that they're so driven. I want to give you a wonderful example. I had 7 people come into me a few years ago. The 7 people knew how to make Civil War movies. One of them had all the camera gear. One of them had all the trucks. One of them had all the props. One of them knew all the places to shoot. One of them had a screenplay. And one of them knew how to bring money together as a line producer. Not necessarily to raise money, but to bring it in and track it as it's spent. So these 7 people came into me after interviewing 10 attorneys. They hired me. And they said, we want to put a deal together. And I said, great. Before we start writing a business plan to raise your money, I want you to go back and figure out your relationships together. Our whole discussion this evening is going to be about relationships together. How much time are you each going to put in? How much money are you going to put in? How much ownership do you expect to have? What do you think your title is going to be? How long do you anticipate being with the company? Not only ownership, but how much compensation are you going to get paid at each stage? So sometimes I'll have people come into me and they say, I want a $200,000 salary from day one. And we're going to go out and raise $400,000 and $200,000 is going to go to my salary. No one will invest in that company. What has to happen is everybody has to have realistic expectations as to how much money they can draw out of the company before it starts making money. And those expectations come from talking to each other. So we had these 7 people involved in this company. It was 1/7 each when they walked in the door. And I said, guys, this is not 1/7 each. I had them go around the room for 2 hours and each one explain exactly what their role was and what they brought to the table. And it wasn't equal. Some people brought more to the table than other people. And I said, I'll bet you this is a 1/7 each company. And they all shook their heads. Yes, one for all for one. We work for Turner Broadcasting. We've made 11 feature-length movies for Ted Turner. And each of them, he made $20 or $30 million. And we each made $100,000 to $150,000. And because we think we can do everything that he can do, including finding distribution once we've made the movie, we want to be able to earn those millions of dollars. And I said, okay, before I start drawing up an agreement between the 7 of you, where it's 1/7 each, I want you to go home, have your own meeting without me. I don't have to be there, and talk about all of these key issues that I brought up. How much time you're going to put in, how much money you're going to put in, what assets you're putting in, what your title's going to be, how much compensation you want now and in the future, what ownership you want in the company. And so they went back, and we were going to meet a week later. I called them up and I said, you guys ready to meet? And they said, no, not quite yet. A couple of guys are out of town. A week later, I called them up and I said, you guys ready to meet? And they said, well, we're meeting next week. Don't worry. We got a handle on it. We've all been talking about it. We're almost ready to go. We just have to have this one meeting. The next week, I called them up. I said, when's the meeting? And they said, can we ask you a question? I said, yeah. They said, how much of our retainer have we used up with you? I think they gave me $5,000 when they first hired me. And I said, you used up $3,500 of the $5,000. You had a problem, didn't you? And he said, yes, we did. And I said, let me guess. The guy who has a completed screenplay, he can hand it to Ted Turner tomorrow and get a check for $500,000 right now. No one else has money. No one else has something that they can get a lot of money for. And he basically said, I want more than 1/7, or I want to get $500,000 when we get our first money in. And he said, you're exactly right. And he said, because he wanted his money up front, or he wanted more than 1/7, we wound up breaking up. Now, before I met with these guys, they had been having weekly or bi-weekly meetings for a year, planning on how to make, they wanted to make 3 movies to start. They wanted to go out and raise $15 million. They knew they had to put together an agreement between them, and then put together a business plan, and then put together an investor documentation, and then go out and start meeting with people. But what they didn't think about was their relationships between each other, and what kind of compensation they expected, and who was going to be the ultimate decision maker, the CEO of the company. And in particular, this one guy who had a screenplay that was worth $500,000 tomorrow, they were asking him to throw it into the pie along with everything else that they were doing. And he said, let's see, I might make $2 or $3 million on this in 3 years after we do our shooting and we sell the rights and we start collecting our money, and I'll get my piece out of it. Or tomorrow I can get $500,000. Guess what? He took the $500,000 and the company didn't go forward. Another example, I had 3 young men come into me a few years ago. Incredible idea for a new technology. They had been working together for 10 years. One was the marketing guy. The other 2 guys were engineers. Well, the marketing guy was the key guy in the company. He put them together. He came up with the new idea. It was an incredible idea that it would take me 15 minutes to describe to you, but it was using laser technology to mark silicon wafer chips. Nobody had done it yet. And it wasn't patentable, but it was proprietary. So when they first came into me, I said, listen, will you guys go back and figure out what your deal is and come back to me? And they said, no, it's 1/3 each, and we're each going to get, I think it was $6,000 a month salary until we start selling product. And then between us, we'll vote to see how to raise the salaries. But it's 1/3 ownership each. Well, about a year into it, they had raised $1 million. They had developed their product. They started selling these machines for $100,000 a piece. They were doing like $10 million in sales in their first year. And they were making an awful lot of money. And the marketing guy, who was the head of the company, who brought everything together, who worked 80 hours a week, and the other guys worked 40 or 50, but they couldn't have done it without him, came to me and said, I really deserve more. And I said, you deserve probably 2/3 of the company, and they probably each deserve 1/6. But I have in my hand a signed agreement that you agreed to a year ago that said you each get 1/3, and you're each going to get about the same salary. And he said, that's right. And I said, well, you have a choice. You can go back to your partners and try to renegotiate your deal, which could create a lot of ill will and might even break up the company. Or you can just say, I'll accept my 1/3 and I'll learn next time. He accepted the 1/3. About 2 years later, they sold the company for $10 million. By the way, this is 30 years ago. So it's like selling a company today for $50 million. And they all made $3,333,000 before tax. Now, the guy who put that company together never had another big hit. The other 2 guys never had another big hit. The guy who should have owned more never had a chance to do it a second time. Did he make a mistake? No. He was right in keeping the company going. He made over $3 million. Should he have gone back at the beginning and rethought through all of the relationships? Absolutely. He should have defined what each of them is going to do and how much they can get. And if you're not sure, I have a trick on how to do it. If you're not sure, you give away half of the startup stock at the beginning. And then the other half of the startup stock you give away a year later, so that and everybody votes on who gets it fairly. There's a second trick on doing it. It's called vesting. It's really important when you first start a company. Most founders don't want their stock to vest. They just want to get their stock so nobody can take it away from them. The reality is, if people make promises that they're going to do things and they don't do them, and they don't work as many hours, or they don't bring in as much money, or they don't invent what they said they were going to invent, or they don't bring sales to the table, or they don't bring money to the table, they don't deserve as much stock. So you can pre-design into each individual's deal vesting schedules that says, for tax purposes, you give them all their stock up front. So let's say it's each of 3 people get a third. But one person who they're counting on to raise money, he only vests half that stock when he signs up. And the other half the stock vests if he raises $1 million within a year. If he only raises $500,000, he only gets half the stock. If he doesn't raise any of the money, he only gets the stock that he started with. So you have more stock available to give to other people. But if you don't go through this discussion very early on in developing a company, you could have real problems later on. I had a client, this is about 5 years ago, wonderful guy. We had done 5 or 6 companies together, raised $70 million together in those companies, but a couple of very successful companies. About to start a new company, building a giant database engine that allows you to store, browse, and tag millions of auto parts. And my client knew how to build database engines, and he brought in a programmer who was an incredible programmer, and they started building this engine. And they all worked on it almost full time without pay for a year. There were like 7 partners. And every time my client called me up, I said, have you had your meeting to talk about all of these key issues that I just brought up to you? He said, no, but we're going to do it soon. For 50 weeks, he kept saying that. Finally, I said, listen, you're about to go out and raise $2 million. You have to lock in ownership with everybody, because I don't think everybody knows how much they're going to get. Well, several of the people knew what startups were. They knew they were going to get 3 or 4 or 5%, and that the person who founded the company and came up with all the ideas and wasn't making any money even at a side job was going to get the bulk of the ownership in the company, except for one person, the guy who did all the programming for them. They walked into the meeting and they all talked about ownership, and they got to this one guy who did all the programming for them for a year. He said, I want 25% of the company. And my client sat there and said, John, I've reserved 5% for you, which is more than anyone else in the room except me. This is my company. And he said, I want 25%. They spent all day from 8 in the morning till 6 at night fighting over it, with him insisting on 25%. And my client upped it to 10%. He said, nope, if I don't get 25%, I'm walking. And this is after a year of writing software where they didn't have any written backup on it. They didn't have any of the documentation of the software because there was no time to create it. By the end of the day, my client called me up and he said, Rick, if I give him 25%, I have to give 15% to each of the other 5 people involved. There isn't enough percentage in the company. And I said, you're right. I said, didn't we talk about this a year ago? And he said, yeah, I know. I knew you were right, but I really thought this guy would change his mind and be, fit in with everybody else once he met us and learned us and saw how good this company could be. And in fact, he walked. And they tried to find somebody to read his code. They couldn't. After a month of searching for another programmer, they started over from scratch. It delayed the company for a whole year. Now, if he had sat down at the beginning and this programmer said, I want 25% of the company, they wouldn't have hired him. They would have gone out and found another programmer who would accept much less. Big mistake from somebody who had already started a lot of companies before, but he thought he had such a good track record that everybody would fall into place wanting to be on his team. And it didn't happen on this one.